Welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. I'm your host, Ariane Sommer, and today it is my profound honor to welcome back a true visionary, Dr. Riane Eisler. Dr. Eisler is a cultural historian, systems scientist, attorney, and pioneering voice for a future shaped not by domination, but by partnership, by cooperation, empathy, and care. Her groundbreaking books, including The Chalice and The Blade, The Real Wealth of Nations, and Nurturing Our Humanity, have transformed how we view our history, our societies, and the possibilities that await us if we choose a different path. In this conversation, we move fluidly through some of the most urgent and tender questions of our time: the future of democracy, the role of partnership in education and economics, the profound importance of gender equity, and how technology, if guided by the right values, might help us build a more caring world rather than entrench old systems of control. It is not only an intellectual journey, it is a call to remember who we can be when we choose partnership over power, care over coercion, connection over conquest. Dr. Eisler's voice is more crucial than ever in this moment of global transformation. I am deeply grateful to share this second conversation with her and with you.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Dr. Eisler, I am truly so moved and honored that you are so generous and are a guest on this podcast again. Welcome back to the Superhumanize podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Oh, absolutely. I have so been looking forward to this conversation. We had an incredible conversation a while ago, and something that has just really touched me on such a deep level was when you shared in the last episode with yourself about your growing up and how some experiences in your childhood have shaped your mission and who you have become.
I would be very happy to. I was born in Vienna, but it was taken over. It was called the Anschluss, the connection. And really the Austrians welcomed it, many of them, to be part of the Reich, so to speak. But yes, because the passion for my work, and as I have a great deal of passion for it, is very rooted in those early experiences of mine. And they were traumatic experiences. And we hear so much about trauma today, which, in terms of the conceptual frame, is what I've introduced, the partnership, domination, social scale, really is a sign that of recognition of something that is really built into domination systems, which is trauma. But we'll get to that. But my trauma started with that because from one day to the next, my life changed from being this cute little girl that people patted on the head to being, my parents and we became hunted with license to kill. And on Crystal night, a gang of Gestapo men broke into our home, dragged my father off. So I witnessed cruelty and violence, insensitivity, but I also witnessed something else that night, and it was my mother displaying what I today call spiritual courage. And it's not the courage to slay the dragon or to kill, but it's the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. And she recognized one of the Nazis as an Austrian who had been an errand boy for the family business. She got curious, just furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back." Now, she could have been killed. Many Jewish people were killed that night. But by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, she got my father's relief. Of course, his release was contingent on some money passing hands. And by a miracle, we escaped to Cuba to Havana, where they purchased an entry permit, and where I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana and witnessed another terrible injustice, really the enormous gaps between those on top and those on bottom at that time, economically, and the poverty all around us, and that I myself experienced until my parents got on their feet. They were not permitted to work there under protective labor laws. So they started a business, and the business did very well. All of this led me to questions about, does it have to be this way? We're told these stories about original sin, selfish genes, right? And they tell the same story. Human nature is bad, right? We have to be rigidly controlled from the top.
Mhm.
Or is there an alternative? And years later, when I started my multidisciplinary, transcultural, transhistorical research, these were the questions that animated it. And as I said, they're deeply rooted in this childhood experience. And I found that the answer to whether there is an alternative to what I later called the domination system, yes, the answer is a resounding yes, but we can't see it through the conventional lenses of our conventional social categories, social studies, because those all fragment our consciousness.
And thank you, Dr. Eisler, for sharing that part of your life. That was just so instrumental in you becoming the force that you are, and someone who is really a light in this world and a change maker. And it is an incredible story of resilience too. If I just think back, I mentioned also in the last episode, I'm German born. My father was born in 1935. He was a 10-year-old little boy when the Second World War ended, and as a child was thrown into this insane world that the adults around him created or just stood by and did nothing. And I have witnessed as a child and later also as a young adult and now that a lot of people from his generation, they would actually not question, they would just shut down. What they experienced was, in their way, traumatic as well as little children, and they just swept it under the rug. They did a lot of good things in life and were change makers in their own right. For example, my father became an ambassador for Germany, did a lot of great things in his life, and also never addressed the childhood trauma. So I just think it is so incredible to use the childhood trauma, the profound trauma that you experienced, as a catalyst to build something truly so beautiful and bright, and something that, in my opinion, gives us so much hope for humanity 2.0.
Well, thank you so much, my dear. Yes, and I'm sure that your father was traumatized, starting in his early family relations, because Hitler, the Nazis, placed a lot of emphasis on what is ignored or marginalized in most studies of society and in all the categories, really: left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, family. And what we're learning today, of course, in my last nonfiction book was published in 2019. It's called Nurturing Our Humanity, and it draws very heavily from neuroscience. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And it opened up a whole new vista for me, because I began to understand on a very personal family level how trauma, as you said, really deadens our capacity to really see reality. That's what you were talking about, wasn't it? And it added a great deal to my understanding of, frankly, my own research, because it took me to 4 cornerstones that we have to pay attention to, because those pushing us back to more rigid, authoritarian, strongman rule, the use of violence, rigid gender stereotypes, whether it's Nazi Germany or the Taliban, Eastern, or fundamentalist Iran, again, religious Eastern, or whether it's the MAGA movement here in the United States. They have very rigid gender stereotypes, don't they? And they pay their social issues, quote unquote, pay so much attention to these rigid and to the ranking of male and masculine over female and, quote, feminine, which are artificial constructs, of course, and nothing in between. They're in complete denial that there can be gay people, which have existed forever.
Oh, yes, and we even see it in nature as in other animal nature.
Absolutely. But to get back to the cornerstone of family and childhood, we know from neuroscience that our early observations and experiences really shape nothing less than how our brains are structured, and hence how we feel, how we think, how we act, including how we vote. And so your father was a product of the Nazis' insistence that in child rearing, as they called it, and it was rearing, that mothers who were very a tremendous amount of discrimination against women in Nazi Germany. They couldn't be judges. They couldn't. Pay scale was lower. They paid a lot of attention to the second, cornerstone of gender. Okay, just like the MAGA movement does here in the United States, of course. But what happened is that they told mothers, you do not respond to your child's distress. That, of course, is a trauma in itself, which we and many families still, the Christian parenting guides, which because my work is very multidisciplinary.
Yes, indeed.
So I look at the whole picture, and they say you have to, quote, not spoil the child. And what does that mean? It means that you scald the child's hands with hot water for not sitting very still at 18 months. Because the main point of child rearing is to teach the child that the parents' wishes are a law. And that is then, of course, carried over to this need, because we're helpless. We depend on our caregivers and our parents for food, for shelter, for clothing, for life. So denial, whether it's climate change denial, or whether it's election results denial, or whether it's COVID-19 denial, doesn't matter. Denial of reality is really part and parcel of the domination psyche.
Yes, Dr. Eisler, and something you have put a big focus on in your work as well is education and educational reform. We've spoken about it in our last conversation, where you also said it's so important that the issues do not only get addressed at the top, let's say politicians, policymakers, and such, but really we need to address the issue at the roots. There needs to also be a grassroots movement, because if we only address the top, the oppressive system rebuilds itself from the base. And of course, education, the way we educate our children, is vastly important, and mostly educational reform is discussed in terms of curriculum updates, standardizing tests, but the conversations rarely address the underlying values that our education system actually imparts to young people. And your advocacy for partnership education challenges this by proposing an integrated approach that nurtures cooperation, empathy, mutual respect, qualities that, in my opinion, in your opinion, and many of our opinions, are actually crucial for navigating the complexities of the 21st century. And so I'd love to learn from you. You, of course, discuss this in your book as well, but what are some of the key principles of partnership education that current systems can adopt? And how could educators begin to implement these changes in both traditional and also progressive school systems?
First of all, I want to say it's really a pleasure being interviewed by you, who understands my work and who has read my book on education, Tomorrow's Children, which sets forth, the subtitle is Education, Partnership Education, a blueprint for partnership education. And it's funny because it was written 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but it is still so very relevant, if not more so than 25 years ago. And one of the things that it advocates, because now getting back to specifics, is education for care. We teach education for everything, for becoming an engineer, for becoming a teacher, but we've inherited a lot of this, despite some reformers, Maria Montessori and so on, from more rigid domination times. So what does education to care, what would it entail? It would teach us caring for self, which again, is the partnership trend, isn't it? All of this emphasis on food and on exercise. It's ridiculous because this knowledge has been there for eons. The understanding that our mental states and our physical states are interconnected. But then it's education to care for others. And science, neuroscience, for example, we get endorphins, neurochemicals that give us feelings of pleasure when we care for another, when we love another, whether it's a spouse or a child or even a pet. We feel good. And there are so many studies showing that, from psychology now, another discipline that I draw from, showing that actually we feel much better when we give than when we receive. And of course, caring for our environment, including our mother nature. And it's all interconnected. And if you notice, our conventional categories for education as well leave out or marginalize nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children. And that is fatal, but it is built into domination systems, because the, quote, man's world was the public sphere into which women are now trying to break in. Some of them, unfortunately, brainwashed, really, by the domination system, because a lot of this trauma affects not only women, but also men, of course, like your dad. We have to really look at root causes rather than just symptoms. And we are not taught another thing in our education, which is pattern recognition. And you were talking about dealing with our complex times. And really, so much of this is interconnected. How we think in families is then translated to how we think in society at large, in our politics, like the punitive family. That Putin, he substantially lowered the penalty in Russia for family violence.
Yes.
Why?
Despicable.
But he recognizes this connection. He connects the dots that a rigidly punitive, often violent, authoritarian, male-dominated family is inextricably connected with accepting and thinking it's the only alternative, really, that kind of state.
Dr. Eisler, I have not even thought about it in that way. The way you connected the dots here is brilliant, and it makes total sense. Yeah.
Yes, we have to be taught that. And I'd have to say that my training as an attorney helped, because people don't come to your office and say, apply Section 1222 to my case. They tell you a story. It is up to you to figure out what law applies. But also, my first job, because I'm like many women of that generation, I finished 1 year of law school, and then I got married, and of course dropped school, which you wouldn't do anymore today. But people did that at that time. And I went back 10 years later to UCLA Law School. They waived their 5-year completion requirement for me. I talked them into it because my grades were very high in that first year. But anyway, my first job during those 10 years, where I wasn't an attorney, was with the Systems Development Corporation, an offshoot of the Rand Corporation. And systems was then a whole new world. And it was a new word, too. And of course, unfortunately, many people who do what they think is systems analysis don't take into account the whole system. Women, children, gender, family. And you know my book on economics, of course, The Real Wealth of Nations. And yes, it's a play on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. But it shows that both capitalism and socialism, both Smith and Marx, really challenged some traditions of domination. Mercantilism was challenged, the rule of kings and nobles, and then Marx came along and challenged it was the early days of the robber barons of capitalism, and it was really brutal. Mines, and it was children were working. It was just awful. But both of them, unfortunately, were so brainwashed that for them, the work of care, which is coded feminine, remember?
Mhm.
This is why gender is one of the 4 cornerstones, or one reason for it. For them, it was to be done, caring for people starting at birth was to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household, which was the norm in these more rigid domination times. I don't think they would today think this way, but at that time they were really brainwashed.
And it is what you said. It's systems, really recognizing the systems. It's recognizing the patterns. It's connecting the dots. And often when we sit in a box, it's really hard to see that we actually only get this picture of being inside of the box. And talking about gender, to stitch onto that, this persistence of patriarchal structures remains a significant barrier to achieving true equality and social justice. And your work, Dr. Eisler, has consistently highlighted the deep connection between gender relations and also societal models of partnership versus domination. And recent global movements advocating for gender equality, the relevance of this connection it's just much more in your face, much more evident than ever. And this year, it's a pivotal year in the United States. The election is coming up, and the prospect of Kamala Harris becoming the first female president and the first woman of color to be president brings to the forefront the deep-seated issues of gender and power dynamics in our society. And what I've just witnessed over the last week or two, despite her qualifications and her experience, she's just been inundated and subjected with a barrage of misogynistic attacks that actually reflect these deeply entrenched dominator systems you've described in your work. And I feel that these attacks are not just personal, but they're symptomatic of a larger resistance to the shift towards partnership models that value equality and inclusivity. And I would like to hear from you, Dr. Eisler. In what way do you see the misogyny? Some of these comments that are being spewed are truly just, I don't even want to repeat them here because they're just so awful. So in what ways do you see the misogyny directed at Kamala Harris as a reflection of the dominator's model of resistance to change, particularly in the context of political power?
I think you've put your finger on the whole issue. Under the old frame, it's right versus left, it's religious versus secular, it's Eastern versus Western, capitalism versus socialism. We need a new frame. And this is what this work offers. Why is this so important? And it leads to the answer to the question that you have about misogyny, because we don't have a unified frame. People pushing us back, as I said, whether it's the Taliban or whether it was Hitler, which certainly I experienced, they always paid a lot of attention to gender. Now, why don't we, and we call them conservative, which is absolutely nonsense. The only thing they want to conserve is the domination system of top-down rankings. But let's look at gender for a moment from a scientific perspective. There are really two basic forms of humanity. One is male, one is female. Now, what do children learn when you rank one over the other? They learn to equate difference, whether it's racial difference, religious difference, difference in sexual orientation, with either dominating or being dominated, with either being superior or inferior, with either being served or serving. So this in-group versus out-group thinking that is characteristic of the domination psyche is acquired early in families. Not everyone, thank goodness. There are those, and I would say you are probably one of them, who say, wait a minute, this is not what I want. But most people are so traumatized by it that I'll jump to a book of mine, which I wrote some time ago again, but is so relevant today. And it's called The Power of Partnership, and it's a how-to book. In fact, it won the Nautilus Award for the best how-to book of that year. But it differs from most how-to books because it shows the connection. It's about 7 relationships, okay? It starts with how we relate to ourselves. That voice in our head saying, you're not good enough. That's the dominator voice. We have to be able to identify it. Then it goes on to look at our intimate family and other intimate relations. And again, a lot of that is, do we rank? Do we link? Do we recognize that there are gay people, that there is something in between these stereotypes? That's a huge difference that you don't see through the conventional categories, because frankly, they don't even talk about family. Religious does, but they consider family values as a violent, punitive, rigidly male-dominated, and authoritarian family. So again, it's that indoctrination. But it shows that it goes all the way to our relationships with Mother Earth, because it's all of one cloth. The conquest of nature, it's the domination of nature, isn't it? And it was once hallowed, and today we're saying, oh my gosh, we live here. It's the only planet we have. Musk wants us to go to some other planet. I prefer to heal our planet. But what the book really shows is something very simple, that trying to heal yourself without also trying to heal society. It's like trying to go up on a down elevator.
That's what, yes.
And so I really highly recommend that book as a start.
Thank you.
And there are many people who are using it in workshops as well and modifying it somewhat. I have no sense of rigidity about any of this, but I do feel that if we don't also address root causes, rather than just trying to put out fires, the symptoms, the environment over here, the racism over there, gender-based discrimination over here, it doesn't work. We need a unified frame because they're all part of the movement to change from domination to partnership.
Yes, indeed, Dr. Eisler. And as you talked also about the family aspect of this, or just the models, the imagery, or the influence we get from our culture scape when we're young. What does it mean to be one or the other? What does it mean to be dominator or dominated? It brought up a memory for me that I haven't thought about in such a long time that is directly linked to this. So when I guess I was 12 years old, I cut my hair short like a boy's when I went we were living in Germany at the time. And I remember I was so proud when we would go to the public pool in summertime. I was so proud I'd be able to wear boxer shorts and not a bathing suit or a bikini. And I thought it was so funny when I went into the ladies' bathroom and the women there would be like, "Oh, you're not supposed to be here." And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And then I remember the first day, it was actually at a public pool where I jumped head first, hands first into the water, and I noticed something in my upper body felt different. It was the day I realized my breasts were growing. No, not much, but I realized, oh my gosh, my body is changing. And I remember I was devastated. I was crying, sobbing, wailing so profoundly in the bathroom. And I was in such deep grief and terror. And as an adult, many years later, I realized at that time I didn't know what was going on intellectually, but I realized because I did not want to be a woman, because what I had integrated in myself that it was not a good thing to be. Because I had integrated this model of that, not believing that men are better than women, but believing that being a woman would give me a life that was not as free as a man's. And I cried and grieved for that when I was just this little girl that noticed the first time changes in her body, because I did not want it.
Well, it's a wonderful story in retrospect. And when you experience it, it was a very sad story, because in a partnership society, you don't have this rigid gender stereotype. You don't have this labeling and demoting of whatever is coded feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is below what was and still is, in many ways, considered normal for men. I don't like the term toxic masculinity because it's name calling, really. But look, men in domination systems not only have to suppress they do get emotions. They get anger and contempt, which is very appropriate for those who dominate, but they don't get the soft, labeled feminine emotions of sadness, fear, etc., which is impossible, by the way. We're all human. But not only that, men are supposed to give nothing less than their lives because some guy on top, like a Putin, wants more real estate. Men have a lot of privileges in the family, in the dominator family. And there are those who are inferior and to be dominated. But how could you not feel this? Look, we tell children and teach children stories like Eve Pandora. Not only is Eve whipped out as an afterthought from a man's rib, but she is blamed for nothing less than all of man's ills. And so is Pandora, by the way. This is not the only story. And in Zoroastrianism, so is the Queen of the Night. It is baked into all of these belief systems. And this is why my first book, and the book for which I'm best known still, The Chalice and the Blade, really reinterprets. My aim was to re-examine our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future. And I have to say, I sometimes say that my life is like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together, because I was always, even as a child, fascinated by prehistory. I remember in Cuba, I had a teacher, and she was the first one to teach about prehistory. I had no idea that there was such a thing. I think we better have an idea, because the archaeological evidence shows that for millennia, much longer than the 5,000 or 10,000 years of domination, we lived in societies that oriented more, not perfect, but more to the partnership side.
Yes, and they were egalitarian and they shared resources, and not even necessarily, if you want to believe quite a few scientists who have also written about this now, not necessarily because they were so much, let's say, better and good than us, but because they were practical and they knew that when a community is egalitarian, when that it's just better for the entire community, for the health and resilience of the community, versus one where it's little scraps trickled down from a potentially hostile and brutal dominator, chief, king type, quote, leader. And I think what you pointed out, Dr. Eisler, just a few minutes ago, also when you spoke about how men get anger and contempt, and that's appropriate to express if you're a dominator or have to function as a man within a dominator type society, but at the same time, they don't get to actually express and often not even feel because they suppress it, the softer feminine types of emotions. And we see the effects of that, the negative effects on mental health and physical health come out right and left. I've experienced it. I've had friends who served, men who actually served this country, went to war, and within their culture, they found it so shameful to even express, okay, I'm actually suffering from massive PTSD. It was not something that as a man within that culture, and even within civilian culture, now it's gotten better, but that you were actually you didn't have license to express. And so I think it's really important to also acknowledge that also men suffer emotionally.
Absolutely.
Under these dominator type societies. And with specifically keeping that in mind, in what ways can current global gender equality movements more effectively align with the principles of partnership systems to create lasting change?
That is the big question, isn't it? Because what the research shows is that the shift has to be global. I'm a Holocaust survivor with my parents, so I know that when people are very traumatized, and trauma is built into domination systems, it's built into it. Economically, poverty is traumatizing. It's built into families. It's built into war, which is a characteristic, of course, of domination systems. War, there are no signs in the archaeological record of destruction through warfare. The earliest ones are 10 to 5,000 years ago, which is exactly when this shift occurred from partnership to domination in a period of disequilibrium. So fortunately, there are movements all over the world challenging traditions of domination, but the real danger is substituting one domination system for another. It doesn't matter who's on top. as long as everything is obscene, trickle-down economics.
Yeah.
But it's hardly new, as you said, whether it was an ancient king or a chieftain, an emperor of old. This is an old system that took over in recorded history. And so we have to be taught the whole of our history. And we have to take into account the whole of humanity. And yes, we have to draw from a database that also includes the whole of our lives, where we all live in our family and other intimate relations. And it sounds so self-evident, doesn't it? But we are not taught. Our educational system, well, think about it. What does it focus on?
Yeah.
It's fragmenting and fragmented in our universities. And you were talking about the misogynism. It's full of misogynism. We have to really examine what we are taught. It doesn't mean that we don't study history and battles, which is so much of what we're taught as history, who won, who lost, but that we look at it in terms of this frame. And there have always, I mean, in the Chalice and the Blade, for example, I have a chapter on early Christianity, and Jesus and Mary Magdalene, we know this from the Gnostic Gospels, which are really a little older than the official Gospels, was a partner to Jesus. And even in the Old Testament, and I know I'm being nonlinear, but it's connecting the dots is fun, because if you look at the official scriptures, Mary Magdalene is first to be admitted to the body of Jesus. Now, why? It was only a very close relative. And she's the one who told Mary, his mother. So obviously she was his partner, his wife. But we don't know this because we aren't taught. You know, that part of the story is conveniently left out.
Yes, yes. And it's so interesting also reflecting back to school. It took me to get into my adult life, just as a small example, to learn about all the incredible contributions female inventors have made to this world, that we're actually living in a world as we're living now, from Wi-Fi to other inventions, who actually made them, which in many cases was women, but that's not necessarily taught in school. Everything back, I'm 47 now, so when I was a little girl, a young girl, and learned these basics, it was looked through a male lens. And of course, what you just mentioned also, we are taught by these texts, by who wrote them, why, what was their goal with how they shared and what they omitted. And what I find interesting is looking from the past to look into the future with regards to knowledge and how it's disseminated. We're standing at the brink of the AI revolution. There's an ongoing debate about the ethical implications of technology and its potential to either entrench dominator systems or foster more equitable partnership-based societies. And your recent discussions, Dr. Eisler, have highlighted how AI, much like any tool, is values neutral, and its impact depends on how is it programmed, how is it utilized. Yeah. And given this context, the ethical programming of AI could play a pivotal role in shaping future societies. So the question that I have, and I'd love to hear your take on this, Dr. Eisler, is how can we ensure that AI and other emerging technologies are aligned with partnership values to create a more empathetic and equitable society?
We have a tool, which is the partnership toolkit, and it can be obtained. And I suggest not the one which it needs to be shortened, the one that focuses on technology, but we condensed it, and it is available for free. We do consulting to help people use it, but as you said, it depends on the values. So if you go to centerforpartnership.org and you look for the partnership toolkit, it really helps us, first of all, to unpack some of how we've been trained to think and how our families think, because that's the first step towards deprogramming the domination programming. But it will take more than that, because unfortunately our economic system rewards the wrong things, doesn't it? And we need new metrics. And we've been working on that, but because even some of these alternatives to GDP, they just give us a snapshot of what is, but they don't show what kinds of investments really make for better outputs, because what are the inputs? And we were trying to develop the social wealth economic indicators. And I also suggest that people go and look at those. There are many resources that we can use that are really healthier. And they're part of healing society, because as I said, we want to change those four cornerstones, and they're all interconnected, and story and language are so fundamental to what we think. And some of it, take the caveman cartoon, which we think nothing of showing a child before our faculties, our brains really are fully formed, much less our critical ability. And in one hand, he's got a weapon, a club. With the other, he's dragging a woman by the hair. So what does it say? It's a story, isn't it? And it tells a story that domination systems, including male dominance, have always been there.
Yes. And it also humorizes something, because what's implied by that cartoon is, of course, excessive physical violence and rape.
That's right.
And kidnapping. So it makes haha out of something that's actually totally atrocious. Why would you show that to a child?
I know. But people need to start asking these questions to really heal ourselves. And that's why I always say we have to heal ourselves individually, but we can't really move to real health unless we also participate in healing society. So I'm very glad that you're doing this. And I do want to talk a little bit about my last book, if I may.
Yes, please. You mentioned it when we just talked before we hit record, and I think it is so beautiful. Please do share, Dr. Eisler.
It's called Yet Love Remains, and it is the story of my relationship for 45 years with my wonderful late husband, David Loy, who, by the way, was the first to really say that Darwin has been, in David's words, misrepresented as this 800-pound gorilla for a domination system, because what he really said in his book on human evolution is that it really much more depends on values, on morality, religion, but progressive religion, of course, than it does. And even in his first book, which has been lionized, on evolution, he emphasizes the importance of cooperation and of caring in evolution. But my book that I wrote after David's death was about our 45 years together, our partnership. And it's a very experimental book. It uses David's poetry and his prose and my prose to tell our story. And it's a love story, and I hope it will be published soon. I don't know how, because it is a different genre. But the thing about partnership, it makes us happier.
Yes, Dr. Eisler, thank you so much for sharing about this book. I personally am so excited for it. And for me, as for someone who has been immersed in your teachings and your books for so many years, it makes total sense. It comes back full circle. And I think so many people would just love to get an intimate glimpse at the partnership that you had, the partnership, the love of your life, and which, in a sense, is also the partnerships that we have in our lives. They're also a big part of the work we put forth on a bigger scale. So I cannot wait to read it. I hope it gets published very soon. And I also do hope that I will then have the opportunity to pick up the conversation with you again, Dr. Eisler. It has been such a pleasure. And for those who would like to connect with you and find you, where can they do so?
Well, they can find me at the website of the Center for Partnership Systems, which is centerforpartnership.org. They can look at my website, which is Riane Eisler, and there's no period between the two E's of Riane and Eisler, rianeeisler.com. They can, if they want to, for example, participate in a new initiative that we are. And also, of course, you can contribute to the center, by the way. There's a donate button. But if you want to participate in a new initiative that we're working on, it's on family violence. See, we've been taught to think of domestic violence, and immediately it is marginalized. So the first thing is to change the name to violence in the family or family violence, and show that ending this violence is going to make us all so much happier and healthier and saner, that we really do have an alternative, and that is a partnership family. Not perfect, but authoritative rather than authoritarian, and certainly nonviolent. And yes, spanking is violence, and the APA said so, and getting religious and spiritual leaders. And I ask you, as a spiritual and health leader, to also be part of it. I hope you will be, to really speak out against this violence, because that is an intervention that really addresses root causes rather than just symptoms.
Yes, indeed it does, Dr. Eisler, and it will be my honor to support that mission. Again, so much gratitude to you. It's just so lovely and such a privilege to be in your presence and to learn from you.
Thank you.